Paul, I have to tell you, this is an absolute honor for me. So I've followed your story for some time. So to get to chat with you in one of these conversations is a real treat. I think for our listeners, I'd love to get started with background on you, kind of your story, what you do, how you got into it, and what's top of mind for you today.
Yeah, absolutely, Carson. Thanks. And I'll tell you, I am honored to be on this little conversation as well. And I've been following your stuff for a while too. We're both native St. Louisans, so we kind of have connected that way. But also, you've written a couple of books and all that. So great to be here. So what I do is I help companies go out there and sell more profitably by competing on value and not price. How I do that is through training seminars. Live training seminars, which I am still doing right now, keynote presentations, virtual meetings, things like that. And so I'm a speaker, author, sales trainer, and podcaster. But what really led to this, actually, my first sales job right out of college, I sold for a company called Feral Gas Propane, where I'm selling a true commodity product. All right. And actually, Carson, this is a side note. When I was selling for Feral Gas, that was at the height of the popularity of the show King of the Hill. Remember Hank Hill, the guy that sells propane accessories? So that's what I would tell people. I'm the Hank Hill. I sell propane and propane accessories. So that it was interesting though, because what I was selling, there were a dozen other competitors selling the exact same product. So I had to figure out how to sell differently and how to approach sales in a different way other than just price, because we couldn't win on that. Then I went to go work for a company called Hilti, selling tools and fasteners, which Hilti's known as the premium in the industry. I mean, their products are typically 30, sometimes 40% higher than the competition, albeit they're better and there's some standout differences, but that also, presented some challenges. That's a big hill to climb when it comes to pricing. And then I sold medical equipment for a few years, mainly in the 8 north central states, and then I covered all of Canada. And that was another challenging sales environment during, when all the healthcare changes were happening. But the one common thread throughout each of those was learning how to compete on value. And how I got to where I'm at right now, actually, the company is called Tom Reilly Training. It's actually named after my father, who started it back in the early 80s. And I remember, this is probably 10, 12 years ago, I approached him. I said, hey, I would like to get into the training business. I had a chance to help coach some salespeople while I was at Hilti, help do some training in more of a indirect type of role. And I really found it rewarding. And so we worked on a plan to make that happen. And the rest is just history, I guess, from there.
I love it. Now, Paul, you said a lot of really great pieces, but at the center of its value, and I want to focus on that a little bit more too. Mm-hmm. And side note, you're also everything I dream to be: speaker, podcaster, author. So
you need to aim higher, Carson. You need to.
I always tell people that too. I think that's funny. Is the people that others deem as successful often have that exact same advice, aim higher, and try to find ways to really leverage your strengths and the superpowers that you have to really go into the stratosphere. So no, I appreciate that very much, and I just want to stay focused on that value piece, because it seems to me, and I was having a conversation about this last week, it seems to me that would be where we would all try to focus as sellers, but it's not. And we allow ourselves all too often to get boxed into corners around price. And I'm curious, first off, how did value-added selling really get started? What was the impetus? The methodology sounds sound to me, but clearly there's a need for sellers. And I'm curious as to how value-added selling got started.
Yeah, it's kind of a great story. So as I mentioned, my dad, Tom, he started our company back in the early 80s, and he wrote the first 3 editions of value-added selling, and my dad, Tom, and I, we co-authored the 4th edition, which is updated really to make it a little more relevant to what salespeople face today. But my dad owned a chemical company down in, I think it was, Houston area, and he was a little guy. Competing in a huge petrochemical world down in Houston. And so he could not compete on price. He couldn't compete against the big guys on price. So he had to figure out a way to compete differently. And that was on value. They had to offer service that nobody could touch. And they didn't have the inventory that everyone had. They didn't have a lot of the things all these big companies had. So he had to figure out a way to compete differently. And that was based on the service that he would provide. Now he sold that company and actually wanted to come back home to St. Louis. And he wanted to build a new business, and that was a training company. Now, this is the crazy part. In the midst between selling his old company, and I think my mom was pregnant with me at the time, and my sister was already here, and he actually developed cancer. He had cancer in his lymph nodes, where they had to remove part of the lymph nodes and all that. But the way they did the surgery back then, there was a chance he wouldn't be able to speak after the surgery. And so he went through all this rehab and all that stuff. And he finally got his voice back after, I think, a couple of months. And think about that, for about 3 to 5 months, he's like, okay, I'm done with this company. I'm starting a new company that requires speaking, and I can't speak. And so then he was able to get his voice back and started the company. While he was training salespeople, he started a first program called like communicative selling, which was great content. But salespeople would constantly tell him, hey, Tom, this is great, but I just keep getting price resistance. How am I going to handle this price objection? How do I do this? How do I do that? And he thought about his old chemical days, and he thought, you know what if I could build a selling system that focuses on competing on value and not price? And so that was the whole idea. And so value-added selling is not a book about how to handle price objections. It's a book on how to prevent them from the very beginning. And that's where I think some salespeople struggle to sell value, is that, first of all, they try to think about ways they can overcome a price objection after it's already surfaced. And really, value-added selling is about proactively taking control of that sales conversation and guiding it down a path of value and away from price. So that's really what led to it. Was early on this is the early 80s I'm talking about now, where salespeople would come into our training and say, hey, I need to know how to figure out just this whole pricing thing. How do I get past it? And that's what ended up, sparking this value-added selling revolution.
I love that. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in sales and leadership in my career. And I think the most frequently asked question is still, to this day, how do I get past these objections? They're really haggling me on price, et cetera. That part of the process started weeks, months, maybe even years ago, when you were leading up to the deal that you're in now. And you're right, the wheels were already in motion long ago. And frankly, the value add, in my opinion, comes in very early going, often when you're prospecting. What is that value that I'm going to bring to the table to entice them to even take a meeting with me in some cases? And I've worked in small organizations, I've worked in large organizations. And I was in a philosophical conversation recently, small business owner, and at an early stage in a business, you may come to the table trying to do anything you can to earn the business, right? So you may make price concessions in those early days or years that you don't want to make later on because you're trying to really build and establish that brand. So I couldn't agree more. And Paul, I'd like to hone in on that, because I think you really hit it. Why we struggle to sell value, and it's because of some of those parameters that lead us to where we are now. The game is being played, and some of the maybe missteps or steps that we felt were necessary previously got us into this price discussion. But how do we get past the price objection? And better yet, how do we set the foundation so that the price objection doesn't even come at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Loaded question, too. There's a lot to cover on there, which we can certainly cover. When we think about price, first things first, when price becomes the primary issue, it's because of an absence of value. Price is only an issue in the absence of value. And I think it's important for the whole community to understand that, because once a buyer fully understands the value of what you bring, how it can impact their business, then price will become less of an issue. Now, there's a couple of things at play here. All right, Carson, you got to remember, think about this. Let's say you're selling an enterprise solution to a large corporation. All right. You're going to spend a lot of time understanding their needs, the discovery, the needs analysis stage, whatever you want to call it. You're understanding their needs. You're putting together a solution based on their needs. You got to remember that for every value-added selling course out there, there's also a course for buyers to do the opposite of what you're trying to do. So you've got savvy buyers, you've got people that know if they can make you feel the pressure, make you feel that pricing pressure, you're more likely to cave in and discount. Because as salespeople, we know what the big fear is. The fear is we're going to lose the business. And that fear of losing the business is so painful that we're willing to give up profit. We're willing to give up our own commissions in certain cases just to get something. We feel that pressure. All right. So there's a few things we can do to balance that pressure out. Number one, we got to make the buyer understand their pressure. We got to ask questions that call attention to their specific needs, things that are important to them, the pressure that they're feeling. And by doing that, it'll make them aware, right? When buyers become more aware of the complexity of their needs and just how bad they need your solution, price becomes less of an issue. So we got to ask those bigger questions that really cause the buyer to think bigger. Another thing we can do, we want the buyer to think into the future. We want them to, we call it stretching the time horizon. And here's what happens. When you got a buyer that's making a decision, they're thinking about what they have to sacrifice today. They're not thinking about what they're going to gain in the future. So you ask questions that cause the buyer to view things in the future. You put them in that future state where they're going to realize that gain. Then it becomes a little more tangible. It's real. But the one practical thing that all these are practical, by the way, but the one practical, easy thing salespeople can do right off the bat is change the conversation. When they start talking about price, change the conversation to total cost instead. And I see this in a lot of heavily commoditized industries that we work in. When the salespeople walk in the door and they'll just start talking to the customer, hey, what's going on? What project going on? And the customer will just say, hey, all this is great, but what's your price? What's your price on this product? What's your price on that? When that happens, salespeople have to regain control of the conversation and switch it towards cost. And they can do that by saying, hey, we'll get to price. I understand price is a factor, but you're focused on price because you want to save on cost. Is that right, Mr. Buyer? And the buyer will agree to that. And then you can talk about any and all the ways you help reduce cost. All right. So those, just a couple of tips, some ideas on how to navigate pricing before, it becomes a full-blown objection.
Gold, Paul. And I loved what you said about how they often will try to force you to price. And frankly, it's because, to your point, they don't see the value right out of the gate. We've got to regain control. It's all about process. Yeah. And I've coached this often as well. Just like we have a process, as do they. And it's often when you don't take the beaten path of the 95, 99% of other sellers who have come before you and failed. If you don't take that same path, that gives you a higher probability of success because you stand out. So I believe strongly in, finding ways to get their attention in different and unique ways. Often you've got to take a unique approach when you're prospecting to get to the meeting, offer some kind of valuable nugget about the industry or insight, but also things that are personal to them. We have that massive well of social information that we can obtain now. So there's no excuse not to do your homework and do your research. You've got to have some unique value to bring to the table in the early going to set the table for where you want to go. And I think, frankly, as well, taking a holistic lens to the discussion. You can't just come in and try to give a litany of the things about your product and service that are superior, because, again, they've got people to answer to. Yeah. And that's another discussion point as well around often we try to arm procurement or other folks in the organization who are not the final decision makers with the information that ultimately we're relying on them to do our job, to sell that internally. And they're the ones also getting pressured on price. And so we've got to make sure we think about this very holistically and arm everybody that we talk to with the proper information. The other key thing, and so I think we'd be remiss not to point out how sales has changed over the last year. Mm-hmm. It's been a dramatic shift. And a lot of the things that you've talked about up to this point, if you've got a strong relationship with a client and you've spent time with them, it becomes not easier, but it becomes a little bit easier in order to build the foundation that we've established. How has selling changed over the last year from your lens, and how are you coaching people today to do the things that they need to do to build the right foundation in a virtual world?
Yeah, that's a great question. When You think about, pretty much a year ago around this time, this is when it all really started to change and was hitting home. The realities were starting to set in. When you think about things that have changed, there's things that have changed for the better. There's things that have created a challenge for us. The virtual experience, and this is one of those things where it drives me a little crazy when I hear about how everything has changed in sales over the past year. It hasn't. All right, that's first and foremost. The principles of selling, the principles of creating value, those are constant. They have not changed. Some of the tactics that we have now changed, all right, forcing us to sell in a new environment. But we got to remember, we're professional salespeople. And now we're forced to sell maybe in a new way for some of us. Not everyone. People have been selling virtually for a long time. But for some salespeople, they're forced into this new environment. When I think about that, I think about like world-class chefs, like a Gordon Ramsay. He's got this show, I think it's called Uncharted on the Discovery Channel. He's a world-class chef, all right? Now, granted, he feels most comfortable cooking at home in his home kitchen. He's going to, whip up some world-class meals. When you put him in a new environment, like on the show, he has to cook outdoors over an open pit flame. It might take him a little bit to get used to it, but he's still going to cook you a pretty darn good meal. Right? Water still boils at 212 degrees, whether it's in his kitchen or whether it's over an open pit flame. So I think the thing that has changed the most, salespeople have been forced to be flexible, more flexible than they ever have before. They are now challenged to do things in a new way, ways that they haven't had to do them before. And so it's created a lot of angst. It's created a lot of challenging in the sense that they're starting to wonder if their process still works, or maybe they're looking for new ideas, new ways to sell. The newness of it has worn off, and it's challenged them to try certain things and to try it in a new way. I think it's created more advantages than disadvantages. If you look at salespeople who are selling across multiple decision makers, they're reaching out to a decision maker in Houston and the other group is in New York, and they got to try to get everyone together. It's easier to do that these days. Salespeople are becoming more efficient with their time and more organized and more intentional in how they reach out to their customers and getting that meeting. They become more aware of their messaging. They can't just drop by an office like they used to, so they got to work on their messaging. This is one of those times where sales really the challenge we're facing has force salespeople to get better in a way that they couldn't before because of the pain and the challenge we face. But I read something the other day that I think is hopeful, because early on in this pandemic, around summertime, when people were really sick of being locked in, we certainly are still now, but one salesperson asked me at a conference, virtual keynote, do you think salespeople are ever going to get to go meet face-to-face with customers again? They were truly concerned about that. And at the time, the data suggested that virtual is permanent and it's here to stay, and that's going to be the preferred method. That was kind of the narrative being played out. And I said, I believe the opposite is true. I think what's going to happen when we do open things back up, when it get back to normal, we as humans crave that face-to-face interaction. Okay, we crave it. It's part of who we are. To be human is to connect with other people. If anything, this pandemic has taught us that. The one thing we needed more than anything from the very beginning was a connection with other people, and we couldn't have it. So think about all the crazy things we would do to get that connection. People would sing from rooftops in Italy. You'd see, people singing to the elderly who they couldn't connect with. You'd see people doing drive-by celebrations. I remember my birthday was just a couple days ago. Last year at this time, my wife organized a drive-by of cars honking and saying happy birthday. It's like 30 plus cars showed up. I didn't even know I had that many friends, right? I thought maybe 4 or 5 would show up, right? But more people show up. So we crave that human connection. I think we're going to notice it once we do open up. Those customers that have received value from sellers are going to welcome them with open arms. They're going to, man, I can't wait to get you back here face to face to see what we've been doing, the changes. I think we're going to notice just a wave of face-to-face interaction. The wave might take a little longer still, but this pandemic has proven that we need that face-to-face element more than screen to screen. So that's just some of the things I think have changed.
There's a critical thing you said in there, Paul, amidst a sea of goodness. But I think it's very important to point out the fact that sales isn't different. At the core is still people and process. And they look very different than they did, and that's where people are struggling, I believe. We've got to figure out, there are, to your point, there's new tools, there's new resources. Time can be used differently than it's ever been. I don't commute, I don't travel, so I can go longer into the day, and there's no geographical boundaries. I can talk to people at any time in the day from anywhere in the world, and I've been able to set up conversations that I wouldn't have necessarily thought to do in a virtual setting. I'm able to do them, and I wouldn't have necessarily been able to finagle them face to face. So looking at those pros, evolving your process toward those pros, and being more effective, there's a lot of pros to a virtual/hybrid environment. I'm in the same school of thought as you are. I think we'll have a hybrid setting. There is a need for connection, and we're going to meet customers where they want to be met. So there is definitely going to be the viability of sitting down face to face. I don't think you'll see as much cross-country travel to make an important meeting happen. But to be said, I think we'll still have the get together for a meaningful meal and a refreshment, and make sure to further the relationship for those who like to sit across the table to negotiate deals. Use your resources in a new way. What fascinates me is I've been on calls over the last year that require maybe another specialist or another member of my team to get involved or engaged. I can ping them and add them to the call in real time, as opposed to tabling the discussion, rescheduling, which can take weeks to get all these schedules coordinated. You can accelerate timelines in sales by looking at all the resources. And I loved your brilliant analogy about Gordon Ramsay. That could be applied too to great athletes that play in different stadiums, or as they change in their career and they get older, maybe they play a different role on the team. You might play a six-man role off the bench, or you might be called in to hit that bloop single rather than the home run, but they can both be just as meaningful. So take a look at where your process needs to shift to meet people where they are in the most effective way. Leverage your resources at your disposal better than ever before. So I couldn't agree more. The last thing I was going to ask you, Paul, was really around, what are you working on right now? What is top of mind for Paul? And how do you think this last year has really evolved your way of thinking as far as your business? Because you've hit on some very topical things around what is at the pulse of sellers. And obviously you've evolved your business model, but always stayed true to the impetus for starting. So I'm curious, what are you working on now, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, absolutely. So, value-added selling continues to be at the forefront of what we're doing. We help salespeople sell more profitably. So we're always enhancing that message. We're getting that message out there, and always continuing to build on that. There is one topic, though, that has been the primary focus as far as the past 8 months. And I say primary focus, and meaning that's where I've spent most of my time writing and researching. We've got a new book coming out this fall. It's actually going to launch sometime in September. I'm still working with the publisher on that, but it's called Selling Through Tough Times. And this is it's not a message on how to sell in a pandemic. I got to say that right and foremost, because the pandemic's going to be gone by then, right? This is a message on how to handle the mental aspect of selling, and also tying it to a process to sell through tough times. Carson, you're a sales guy, and you know that no matter how great you are, at certain points in your career, you're going to fall on tough times, whether it is selling through a recession, right? Which you were selling in the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. You remember what that was like. I remember what that was like. It was a tough time to be out there selling. Certain industries face tough times. Think of oil and gas. Earlier this year, it's rebounded, but oil and gas last year around this time was getting absolutely hammered. You remember crude oil dipped below $0 a barrel, right? Because of certain contracts expiring and things like that. But certain industries face tough times throughout the career. And so what I wanted to do is put together a book that will help salespeople just manage the mental aspect of selling through those tough times, and also give them a process that will help them move forward through that tough time. And that's what I created. And right now we have it with the publisher, so we're in the editing phase. But it's an exciting book. There's really nothing out there like it. Which, as I researched it, there's books on mental toughness. There's plenty of books on that, and there's some great books on that, by the way. But very few books are then tied to an actual sales process or written through the lens of a salesperson, because sales has always been a tough profession because you fail more than you succeed. I mean, you could fail 90% of the time and still be considered successful. So sales is an interesting profession. It's filled with uncertainty. And this book is going to really help provide the foundation for anyone getting into sales, facing tough times. And man, I'm thrilled to have it get out there. So it's coming September 2021, just around the corner.
Okay. Well, Paul, my book queue just grew by one today, so you'll definitely count me as a reader. I love it. Autographed, I hope. And yes. I love what you just said around the tough times. This tough time concept is not new. That's a message for all time. And, I'm a believer we're in a probability game, and you can make another sports analogy. There's a lot of phenomenal baseball hitters that have gotten hits less than 30% of the time, and yet they're considered the greatest ever. And I think we've got to realize what we can control. We can control the quality of our outreach. We can control the quantity of our outreach and the quality of messaging and our value add, those types of things that we can control, and also the consistency. And I think we don't give ourselves enough credit sometimes as far as how much we can control. Even in a tough time, you can control elements of that. Maybe you increase your frequency of outreach. Maybe you toggle your message around, how will this business face the time that follows this tough time? We want to be prepared. We want to prepare you for those times. So your messaging may change, but you can control those three critical elements. So we've got to give ourselves the credit that we deserve to know that we control our destiny in the selling game. That's the one thing I love about selling, is that if you invest in yourself and in your discipline, your knowledge of selling, and continue to evolve your process, over time, you'll be successful. No matter how many times you get knocked down, just keep coming forward. So, Paul, this was a blast. I really appreciate it. Anything else you want to share? How can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I'm very active on LinkedIn. That's probably where I'm the most active on all the social channels. So, follow me on LinkedIn or reach out on LinkedIn. Also something we have available for the sales community is the Q&A Sales Podcast. This is a podcast I launched, probably about a year and a half ago now. And the premise of the show is pretty simple. Salespeople will fill out question forms, and then I'll turn it into a show. For example, just today, someone emailed through the show, and they're in the banking industry, and they want to know, how do I convince the buyer to buy our CDs, the certificates of deposits, when our interest rate is lower than the competition? So I'm going to analyze that. I'll turn it into a show for that salesperson. So yeah, check it out. It's available wherever you get your podcast, the Q&A Sales Podcast. And also you can check out the website, the QandASalesPodcast.com. There you can ask a question, and I turn it into a show.
Love it. No, I can vouch for the podcast as well. Great stuff. Honor to connect. Thank you so much, Paul. An absolute pleasure, and great success with the book and your continued training journey. Thank you for what you do for not only our community, but for the selling community.
Absolutely. It's a privilege to do it. Thanks, Carson.